Well, hey there, guys. I'm Axel the Beast with ZeldaEngine.net, and in my last video I discussed why I'm against Operation Moonfall, which is the fan campaign to have Majora's Mask remade in the same way Ocarina of Time 3D was. Hilariously, the fan backlash, or the viewer backlash, and support for the video was pretty much evenly split, and as a result of the controversy, it was pretty much my most successful video ever. Go controversy! But there have been a lot of interesting points made since I made the video. Lots of commenters with their own opinions, and there was even like a news post response by ZeldaInformer to the video. So I thought I'd make this video as a follow-up and post some of my my new thoughts that I've had as a consequence, and address some of the new things that were stated and some of the new ideas that were brought up about it. But before I really get into this video, there's one thing I wanted to cover real quick, because this is something a lot of people missed about the last video, is I'm not against Majora's Mask on the 3DS. I'm not against ports and re-releases at all. I think that companies should release lots of them so that all kinds of people can play old games. It's remakes I'm against, and unless there's a reason for them or that they should be made, and I discussed that a lot last video. I'll get into that a little more in a bit. And also, for the record, I think it's really highly likely that there will be virtual console re-releases of Majora's Mask on both the Wii U and 3DS. I really think it's going to happen. So I really don't think Majora's Mask fans who want to play the game on those consoles really have anything to worry about. Now then, let's start off this video for real with ZeldaInformer's response to my video, which I'll link to in the description, but what stuck out to me most about it was how they talked about Grezzo, the development studio that worked on Ocarina of Time 3D, and how they might not exactly be the most competent company, or at the very least, they're not that skilled at making games on their own. They've kind of turned out mostly not too high-quality sequels to the Mana series. You know, I wasn't really aware of that stuff, so that's actually a good point, ZeldaInformer peeps. You know, perhaps in that case, Grezzo working on a new Zelda title or an original title might not be the best, but then again, you know, Grezzo might have actually been held back being forced to work on the Mana series, so it's still theoretically possible they could produce a good original game, although still, you know, that's kind of a stretch, so I don't know, disregard that. That said, I still don't really think that Grezzo or anyone really should necessarily work on Majora's Mask 3D, because frankly, it's just like there's bigger fish to fry. I mean, even a remake of the original Legend of Zelda or Adventure of Link would make more sense given those games' position in, like, the series release timeline and the status they hold. It makes more sense from, like, the status of the game standpoint than Majora's Mask. That said, I still don't really think that a Zelda remake of any kind is really necessary. I mean, the only objective, benefits to having one really are the same kinds of things that are solved by porting the game, which, again, I'm totally for, so I don't see why a remake is really necessary. Now, admittedly, there's a bit of a gray area that I should probably touch on, which is the distinction between a re-release and a remake. And honestly, there kind of isn't one. Most would define a re-release or a port as re-releasing the game, but not changing anything about it. But that's never the case, because in order to make the game function on new hardware, you need to tweak the programming and the way the game is designed. You can still keep the game itself intact, but you have to change a couple things to make it work. And similarly, a lot of people still add a couple new features to a remake, and it's still called, to a re-release, excuse me, and it's still called a re-release. So, and, you know, that's what they did with, the final mix re-releases of the Kingdom Hearts games, and those are still pretty much considered re-releases as far as I know. So, you know, that's an example of, they have changes, but they're still pretty much the exact same game. You just tack a couple new things on. Remakes are usually defined as full recreations of the game, but in many cases, people still apply the term to re-releases that have a large number of changes. Ocarina of Time 3D was almost universally described by, everyone as a remake. You know, it's the same game, it just has a lot of new little bits of content and little tweaks and changes. I don't think that I think what really made it be considered a remake and what tipped it to that side of the argument is the complete overhaul of the graphics, because it is a complete overhaul. Those aren't the same graphics that were in the game, and while some of the 3D models are still based on the old ones and the areas have the same rough design, they totally redid the graphics, so I think that's kind of what gives it the remake status. And I think that's a reasonable term to use, really. Perhaps the term people suggested in the comments, which is remastering, would fit better, but that's not exactly an established term, and either way, I think it's reasonable, and, you know, either way, I use that term twice in a row, that's weird, it is still a gray area, I will admit that. But really, this distinction is like little more than a semantics argument, because we're only talking about like these distinctions between the terms, but most of my arguments were leveled against things that the Ocarina of Time 3D, and thus by extension Majora's Mask 3D, actually was, not some kind of like abstract definition of the term remake. You know, I'm not actually so against Operation Moonfall that I want to dedicate every fiber of my being to stopping it. I probably would get that way if people were dedicated to, like, you know, the tide of remakes that I complained about last video. You know, but if it ends with Majora's Mask, or at least ends for a while, it's not like this regular thing that's going to go steady, there's not like this tide of remakes, then I can actually accept it. And, you know, if you want it, go for it, because your opinion is just as valid as mine. It's simply not something that I want or that I feel is beneficial to, you know, anything, or it's just not something I think Nintendo should be putting any time or energy on, or Grezzo either. I mean, there are probably other games Grezzo can work on by being absorbed into the staff working on the game. I mean, unless I have my facts wrong, a lot of Nintendo games, and indeed a lot of games in the industry in general, have these really huge teams that need to work on them, so I'm sure Grezzo could do some good working on, you know, other games. So I don't think Majora's Mask 3D is the best use of resources, because I don't think it really matters a lot. It doesn't change a lot, it doesn't add a lot to the series or to anything. Whatever it would add, as far as I can see, most of it is really just covered with, would be covered if they made a re-release or a port. There were a couple other arguments that were made that I wanted to briefly touch on, one of which was that people suggested Majora's Mask should be remade so it can get the exposure it never had, and if that's the reason that you're supporting Majora's Mask 3D, then I think definitely right now is not the right time to make it. Majora's Mask was overshadowed by the other Zelda games released at the time. Ocarina of Time, the Oracle games, and, you know, the Wind Waker. That's 4 games. If it was released right now, it would be overshadowed by Ocarina of Time 3D, Skyward Sword, and probably the new games you know, inevitable upcoming games on the Wii U and the 3DS. So the problem is that it was overshadowed, it would be overshadowed in the same way now. If that's your reason for wanting a remake, then now is not the time. It's something we should wait on a little longer. Then, going along with that, there's also the fact that Majora's Mask isn't really an underrated game. I mean, it's widely known and rewound. It's not underrated like people say it is anymore. It just doesn't have that status anymore. It's a critically acclaimed gem of the series, really. And you know, so widely known and renowned that it doesn't really need a remake to catch attention. There's nothing that would do that a port wouldn't do. People would also say that they want the graphics overhauled as part of the remake or port, because so it could appeal to people who want to play games with good graphics and wouldn't play it otherwise. Well, there's a few things there. One, the people who value good graphics as a major element of the game aren't exactly the people who play Zelda. Zelda has never been a cutting edge. It has never been a cutting edge series graphically, and you know, the people who are into that, who only play games with the graphics, they generally do not frequent series like Zelda. They frequent cutting-edge, realistic games, usually. 2, I still don't really value graphics as such a crucial element of game design, and you may disagree, but that's ultimately my stance on it. It's not this thing that makes or breaks the game. And I mean, some genres do rely more on the visuals, but Majora's Mask and Zelda, not so much. And I still maintain that Majora's Mask visuals are pretty much sufficient. And 3, and I repeat this pretty much from last video, but you know, people don't go around you know, taking an old game that was good and saying, well, these graphics are kind of outdated, so let's remake the game. I mean, if the game is good, why remake it just for the graphics? I mean, that's not what made the game. That's not what, you know, it really has to do with what the game is. I mean, why is that important? Why does it matter? And what value would the remake be to anyone, really? Now, finally, there was people talking about how if they remade Majora's Mask, they could do what they did with Ocarina of Time 3D and add new stuff, such as the boss challenges. Well, the boss challenges are pretty much already in Majora's Mask. I mean, Majora's Mask, if I have my facts straight, is pretty much the first game to allow you to refight the bosses. Tacking on a gauntlet and a time trial to an already existing functionality doesn't really justify an entire remake, though I suppose I'll admit it wouldn't do that much harm if it was just added on to like a re-release, since that's really very little time and effort to put that in, so yeah, you got me on that one, I guess. Included in that as one of the things that they can do that Ocarina of Time 3D did, is to make a Master's Quest for Majora's Mask, and that is also kind of moot by the very nature of Majora's Mask. Master's Quest was made so that they could have a harder, harder dungeons for Ocarina of Time. But Majora's Mask is already pretty much identified as, like, one of the hardest games in the series, so what would the point be, really? If your justification for wanting a remake is that you want new areas added to Majora's Mask, then why would you want a remake at all? I mean, you've got entirely new areas, so why don't you just add the new graphics, the new music, new items, etc., and you just make a new game? If your reason for supporting Majora's Mask 3D is because you want new dungeons, then really what you're pretty much asking for is a new Zelda game entirely. Well, those are the last of my thoughts on, well, my follow-up thoughts on the Operation Moonfall issue, and as always, I'm very interested in hearing your guys' opinions, and, I'll read the comments and respond if I can, and, just post in the comments and talk to me about the video and tell me what you think, and, I meant what I said. If you want Operation Moonfall, then you should support it. I mean, these are my thoughts. If you disagree, then that's that. I mean, if that's what you want, then your opinion is just as valid as mine on this issue. Ultimately, Nintendo will probably decide to make Majora's Mask 3D or not based on, which side is in the majority. So if you really want to support it, I'll be on my side, you be on your side. It's cool. Just that neither side is necessarily wrong. Alright guys, that's it for this time. See you guys later. They totally redid the graphics. They totally redid the graphics. They redid the graphics.